It's been a couple of weeks with Ursula's return now into the metagame, and as expected, we've seen some developments in the meta that have caused certain decks to rise and others to fall. In this video, we're going to go ahead and revisit Emerald Steel, which is a deck that I and many others said was positioned to be the strongest deck in the format. Well, in these next couple of matches, we're going to evaluate if that's still the case. I do still think Emerald Steel is one of the strongest decks in the format, especially in a best of 2 setting, simply because on the play, this deck is incredibly strong still. When you think about what Lorcana is, you draw 1 card each turn, and you have to ink and play a card. So you're going -1 every turn unless you generate some form of advantage, which you usually can't do until later on when you develop 4, 5, 6, 7 ink. Well, if you're on the play, or even on the draw, as you can see in this particular matchup, if you're able to additionally force your opponent to use up resources in the form of discarding their cards. Now they're going -2, -3 each turn. And in the early turns of the game, and this is why discard is such a problem, they don't have anything to generate that kind of advantage before turn 4 or 5, right? This matchup is necessarily not as bad as it used to be in set 3 though, because you can draw with Merlin Rabbits and Queen's Castle and things like that. And even if I discard your cards as the Emerald Steel player, I'm not necessarily gaining additional advantage off of that, such as like drawing extra cards with Prince John. We talked about in set 3 how Ursula, Deceiver of All, singing a Sudden Chill with the Prince John on board represents -2 for your opponent and +2 for you as you draw 2, right? That was a game-winning play. You don't necessarily need that in this deck anymore, because if you're going with the Bucky-oriented version, the Floodborns that are afforded to you in this ink combination of Emerald Steel are very, very strong. Here you can see when you get this kind of busted nuts play with the turn 2 Bucky, including the shift of the Diablo onto the turn 1 drop the Diablo, you're just going to get so much advantage here, because it's essentially the same thing, right? You force your opponent to discard, you pass it over to them, they draw a card, you draw a card. So the opponent, despite being on the play here, is only on 2 ink. They're going to have to ink for turn, and then they're going to have to probably play an interaction, which is going to put them down to 3 cards. And if I have another Floodborn, which I have 2, the Aladdin and the Jafar, it's going to put them down to 2 cards. And only being on 3 ink, it's going to be a really tough battle for them to even play half of their deck, right? Because, you know, only, let's say, 20 to 25 cards are probably under the 3 cost curve in most decks. So here you can see me drop the Aladdin and use the strength on the Flynn Rider, and because the opponent opted to drop the Olaf again after bouncing it back with the Mim Snake, they were down to 2 cards, which means now they're down to a single card, not even able to ink on turn 4, and you can just see kind of the advantage that we've been able to develop here. So if you understand the concept behind Emerald Steel and what it wants to do despite being on the play or on the draw, knowing your matchups and knowing the best approach that you can take in that particular matchup, you can just get to a state of the game like this. And what you saw there was me discard the final card in the opponent's hand, which was an uninkable. And that's another huge pro of Emerald Steel discard, is that if you are able to aggressively develop your board here, your opponent is stuck with those uninkables that they can't play. And this is why this deck is pretty decent into the Ruby Sapphire matchup, because they play so many uninkables. If you can kind of get to a state of the game like this, like even if they draw their powerful cards to deal with Emerald Steel, do they even have enough ink to play it, right? And those are decks that try to aggressively dump their hand with a Fishbone Quill, so it just makes discarding even easier. So yeah, you can see here there's nothing the opponent can really do. I think they're going to end up scooping it up shortly. Yeah, they're just at a loss on what to do here. Drawing cards that they can't play, most likely. We're going to drop this Robin Hood and see what they top decked. They're only on 4 ink. They don't even let us see us, and they see it. They just end up resigning. Next up, we're going up against Ruby Amber, a deck that I think got a lot better with Ursula's return. However, being on the draw is still a major weakness for this deck, just because it's harder for them to claw back tempo if they're not doing something like running the Be Prepared, which is why you saw in my build I opted to try and figure out a way that this deck can overcome its, I don't want to say its biggest weakness in going second, but it is a pretty big weakness for this deck. Anyways, on the play, we're going to be able to drop Diablo, kind of see what we're working with on the opponent's side, and they have double Goofy and double Rapunzel, as well as a Beast. No turn 1 play and no Brawl is very, very good for us, because it means that we're going to be able, despite not having a Bucky, to just develop a couple of threats on board, get some early quest in. And because I saw they had the Beast, I'm going to not shift my Diablo here and keep my strength to prevent them from dropping Beast and getting the Rapunzel draw on the following turn. So you can kind of see how the Diablo actually plays a big role, the 1-drop one, in helping to establish your lines of play later on. So we just hardcast the 1 Diablo, and this was, I don't want to say a mistake necessarily, but I was kind of just baiting to see if they wanted to crash their Flynn Rider. This thing is not threatening right now, and it won't be for a couple of turns, because until they can drop the Maui, the Flynn Rider just doesn't really do too much. So as expected, they drop Beast on turn 3, and knowing the opponent's hand, you know, is very, very powerful here, just because you see me able to know to keep the strength in order to take out the Beast and stop the Rapunzel draw. Now, questing with the Robin Hood on this turn was a mistake, because I knew they had 2 Goofies, and I saw them ink 1, but they're just going to drop the Goofy here and take out my Robin Hood for free. Thankfully, I don't get punished because I top deck Let the Storm Rage on the following turn, which allows me to take out the Goofy. But the Goofy wasn't really going to do anything in the following turn anyways, other than quest for 1, because we're not going to quest with our 1-drop Diablo. We're only going to use our evasive Diablos here. So the Flynn Rider, again, not threatening anything too much right now. Yes, they might drop a Maui next turn, but we do have a lot of draws coming down the pipeline because the Madame Medusa is still 2 turns away. So this Beast is going to draw 2. The Diablos are going to draw 2. It's just insanely powerful. Despite not having Bucky, we're able to keep pace with the Ruby Ember player, and they haven't even been able to pop off on a Rapunzel just yet. On turn 3, they drop a Maui's, or sorry, on turn 4, they drop a Maui's Fishhook. Or, geez, it's turn 5, despite them only being on 4 ink. They drop a Maui's Fishhook and a Pluto. And again, this is just like too little too late at this point. They were probably better off inking and dropping the Maui that they have in hand and just leaving their Flynn Rider readied up, because, well, I mean, it wouldn't have mattered. And like, this is this play is actually a little bit better because it forces me to use some resources. But even if they drop the Maui, I would just strength it again, unfortunately for the opponent. So it would put them in an even worse position. But here you're going to see me use one of the strengths just to prevent the Rapunzel coming down and drawing 1 off that Pluto. Just keep them off their characters entirely. And there's almost nothing the opponent can do here. So they're going to end up inking a Rapunzel and then now dropping the Maui after missing ink last turn. And this is, again, what I talked about in the first matchup. It's like you're drawing your card per turn, you have to ink and play a card. So you're going -1 every turn. And unless you can generate that advantage with like draws, which in this case the opponent couldn't do until they established their Beast, played the Rapunzel, that takes them multiple turns to set up. Like if I'm discarding your cards in addition to that, you're just functioning a little too slowly to do anything here, right? So here we're finally going to drop the Bucky and the Robin Hood, and now it's just like game over for the opponent because they're going to be stuck on 5 ink more or less. They drop a Rapunzel off of the Bucky discard, and then the strength takes out the Maui there. Now we're just going to quest with everything that we're able to, still draw off the Diablos, and despite not having the Beast anymore, like Bruno back to hand whatever they got, play the Jafar to force the discard, or the Pegasus, right? And we can sing the Bruno with the Tinkerbell. Like there's nothing the opponent can do in this situation. Not even a Be Prepared is going to be able to wipe up the board since they don't have the 7 ink. So Sapphire Steel is a deck that I do think is probably the new best deck of the format, simply because when it's constructed the right way and piloted the right way, it does seem to be the most consistent and resilient deck in the format. This deck has traditionally been very, very hard to pilot though, so I don't think you see too many people on this unless the person is a very, very good player. So for example, on the Chicago Challenge, I think Brennan DeCanio opted to play Sapphire Steel, and he kind of outlined reasons why in one of his winter interviews, and it's understandable why. Like it's the deck that, like I said, can deal with more or less any situation, and it has a particularly good matchup into Emerald Steel. In this matchup though, we're once again on the play, so very, very strong for us. We do have the 1-drop Diablo to see the opponent's hand, and knowing that, you see me go for this Ursula Deceiver instead of the Bucky in order to rip the 1 jump ahead, because that represents more value as their turn 2 play than me dropping a Bucky and having a random discard off of it if I shift Diablo. So I do end up shifting the Diablo still to get the draw, but I'm aiming to try to slow the opponents down as much as possible on their ramp. It's fine if they develop the Smee and the Robin Hood. I stop the ramp, which is going to prevent them from getting some of their damage removal off on me. We're going to go ahead and now shut down the Robin Hood shift, which is really strong for us here. And we're probably going to drop the Bucky. You could argue that I could drop the second Ursula here, but I think I just need to keep that in hand to rip out a potential song that could come down on the later turns. And now we're looking to be in a really strong position. The Diablo, man, is just so strong. And despite the opponent being on Steel, being on Baboom, Let the Storm Rage on, you know, all these things that can remove it, it's just not going to be good enough right now in the early game to deal with what we have. So they drop a Stone Dragon, and I've talked about this card in the past being a card that can help you mitigate that negative advantage of having to constantly ink from hand. However, in Sapphire Steel, I don't think it's necessarily the best, but you know, we'll see how the metagame develops. I do think it's a little bit stronger in Ruby Sapphire, personally. Regardless, though, the Bucky into the second Diablo here just puts the opponent on an even faster clock. Again, not having to ink from their hand now represents some good value. They still do ink from hand, but they're going to be able to still develop ink, which means their top end threats will still be able to be played. Like, all it takes for the opponent to kind of get back into this game is one grab your swords, right? That would wipe out more or less my whole board except for that Ursula. But we're going to probably check out, yeah, now that the opponent is potentially pushing on game 5, check out their hand again with that Ursula Deceiver, rip the grab your sword. So again, the Emerald Steel player should have the tools necessary in order to combat what the opposing player is doing if you're piloting this deck the right way. And I don't even remember what the last card in the opponent's hand was, but you can see here the board states we have the Hidden Cove up now, which is going to make the Diablo more resilient to Babooms and Let the Storm Rage On and grab your swords. The double draw here is just too much for the opponent to deal with, despite the Stone Dragon being able to ink for them. It's just too slow in this scenario. They ink a Robin Hood, and if they have a Tinkerbell here, it's not the worst. Okay, they do. Yep, they do have the Tinkerbell. It takes out our Bucky, but the Bucky definitely did what it needed to do. And like I said, that Hidden Cove is definitely putting in some work. If I should have moved the Bucky there. Like, why didn't I do that, right? And I could have moved the Diablos there later. But yeah, between the Tinkerbell and the singing of the Strength of the Raging Fire, it's just too much for the opponent to deal with. The double draw off the Diablo, oh man, it's just like, what do you like? It's such a demoralizing deck to play against. Not even a top deck grab. Well, I guess a top deck grab your swords could do some work because it takes out the double Diablo. It takes out my whole board except for the Tinkerbells. But yeah, seeing them top deck a one jump ahead, which is one of the detriments of a deck like this, like that plays one jump ahead. It's like drawing it into later on in the game just feels so underwhelming. We go super wide now, you know, not having to fear or be prepared or anything like that. Put the Pegasus on the Cove to get +1 so that, you know, it's actually kind of pointless to do that. I guess it would survive a Tinkerbell top deck, but that's about it. We're on 7 ink, the opponent's on 9. So, you know, the Stone Dragon is able to keep pace, but it's just too little too late, and the opponent ends up scooping it up. So I normally wouldn't include this match, but I do want to point out some of the key interactions between Ruby Amber when they're on the play, because this opponent had the perfect hand to beat me in my opinion, but they made some very critical missteps, and again in my opinion, in terms of what they were inking and some of their decision making, that really cost them this game, where I think they definitely could have outdrawn the discard. And this is where Ruby Amber can really be strong. I mean, the odds you get a hand like this is probably unlikely with what you're going to see the opponent end up playing out here. But again, I'm not on those 1-drop Plutos, but you know, dropping it here on turn 1 on the play is extremely strong. So when you do get this set up, you're in a really good position. They inked the Julieta, which does represent card draw against the discard decks. And as I mentioned in the Ruby Amethyst portion of the video, you can afford to draw cards against Emerald Steel now because they don't play Prince John, so that you're not necessarily at risk of, yes, I'm having these extra cards in my hand that are going to get discarded, and it gives the opponent the advantage when I discard. So here, you know, they dropped a Mulan, they ink a Rapunzel, which I would definitely disagree with. I would not be inking Rapunzel more or less in any situation. Here they ink a second one, and this is some of the critical mistakes that they make, because those Rapunzels, like being a 1/5 body means that you can crash Rapunzel into most of the things that I play and then heal it up with the next Rapunzel, right? So you have basically like draw 8 available at your disposal, because the opponent had 3 different Rapunzels there. So we are going to be able to shift this Robin Hood and take out the Pluto, which is nice here. It's because it's going to get us 2 lore and slow the opponent down a little bit. But here you can see a scenario where they could have used this Rapunzel on field to crash into my Robin Hood, then drop one of those Rapunzels that they inked and draw 3, right? And it's just like my discard isn't going to keep up with a draw 3 off of Rapunzels here. So on turn 4, they're going to ink a Goofy because it's not really doing anything in this scenario. And I think they drop a Gaston here, which again, I'm not a big fan of this card. You know, between the Pluto and the Gastons, that's a lot of uninkables that you don't really want to run in this deck in my opinion, because your uninkables should be your high impact cards like your Madame Medusas and things like that. But we're going to end up inking this Bruno and probably playing out a Diablo because we have the Let the Storm Rage On that we can follow up with next turn. But this Rapunzel being a 1/5 body means that the Robin Hood can't take it out. We don't necessarily want to exert the Robin Hood, but I think I do end up exerting it, so a bit of a misplay on my end if I do quest with it, just because you don't anticipate people being on that big Mulan, but if they are, it could be a problem. So I end up questing with the Robin Hood, And again, the opponent just not thinking through their lines here. They have another opportunity to blow up my board because they could use this Rapunzel, crash into the Robin Hood, right, to deal 1 damage to it. And then you're going to see them play this Fishhook, but they're going to ink a Mulan where they had the opportunity to shift Mulan. And if they would have shifted Mulan here, Mulan would have, I think, 5 strength. So between the Rapunzel dealing 1 damage to Robin Hood and Mulan taking out the Robin Hood, they could also deal 5 damage to the Diablo, taking out my Diablo, leaving me with only a Bucky on board. And they would still have a pretty developed board with the Gaston, the Mulan, and the Rapunzel on field. And again, if they would have kept the Rapunzels, they would have had additional card draw, not be down to their single card. Instead, they opted to drop this Fishhook, probably thinking that it's easier and, you know, maybe more for the long game that the Fishhook could do more damage because, you know, Mulan represents a one-time sweep, but the Fishhook represents them being able to out the Diablo multiple times. But because this Gaston has 2 damage on it, we're going to be able to, just sing the Let the Storm Rage On, take out the Gaston with the Diablo, and then drop the Aladdin as a Floodborn target to discard the opponent's final card, representing another uninkable in the Scar there. So just too many uninkables, which makes your matchups into these discard decks much weaker. But the opponent had the busted nuts. They had everything they needed to win the game if they just would have kept those Rapunzels. But now only on 5 ink, and having gone through most of their Rapunzels already, the opponent likely just can't do anything here. I think they just sit here for a little while, just kind of contemplating, you know, what have I done maybe, because look at the board state, look at the cards in hand, like there's almost no chance that they come back from this. The Rapunzel can't get damage on it, so even if they top deck their 4th Rapunzel, like it's just like the card in hand they have to play out, or they just lose, right? Because I'm going to discard it next turn anyways. But that's going to do it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed, let me know in the comment section below. Thank you again for watching, and make sure you drop a like if you did enjoy it. Thank you. Quantum is out.